Hi, my name's Kurt. Welcome to 7 Best Things, a positive look at pop culture. Today we're counting down the Beatles' 7 biggest US hits according to the Billboard charts. Starting off our countdown, there's no number 7 because we have a 4-way tie for number 6. Number 6, I Feel Fine. I Feel Fine is a great song to open this list because it has one of the best openings of any single of all time. The first 6 seconds of the song is made up of guitar feedback. The first time that feedback had been incorporated into a hit record. 6 seconds of feedback is a long time for a pop song that lasts only 2 minutes and 25 seconds. Even all the way back in 1964, the Beatles were being incredibly creative and inventive in the studio, pushing out the boundaries of rock and roll. What makes the feedback in the beginning work so well is that it immediately segues into one of the catchiest guitar riffs of all time. John wrote the guitar riff while they were recording their 4th album, Beatles for Sale. He liked it so much, he wanted to write a whole song around it. And the other Beatles encouraged him to do exactly that. When he came back and they recorded it, they realized they had the A-side for their new single. I Feel Fine was released in November of 1964, backed with She's a Woman. Both songs became top 5 hits in the US, with She's a Woman climbing to number 4 and I Feel Fine going to number 1 and staying there for 3 weeks. It became the Beatles' 6th number 1 of 1964, giving them 6 number 1s in a single calendar year, an all-time record. Number 6, Help. In 1965, trailers for a new movie from the Beatles came out. They told the public, "Stop worrying. Help is on the way." Indeed it was. Help would be the title of the Beatles' 2nd film, their 5th album, and their 10th UK single. Help was released as a single in July of 1965, with the album and the movie soon to follow. It's amazing to think that the song Help was released a mere 8 months after I Feel Fine. Both are excellent singles, but they almost sound like they are recorded by 2 different groups. Help shows that the Beatles matured a great deal in 8 months. Their music is more sophisticated, their recordings are more polished, and their lyrics are exceptional. Help, lyrically, is the opposite of I Feel Fine. Everything is definitely not fine. The Beatles have been overwhelmed by their unprecedented success. Their work schedules are insane. They never have a break, and they are starting to wear out physically and emotionally. John is making a cry for help. In fact, that's exactly what he says in an interview in 1980. He says, "I was fat and depressed, and I was crying out for help." Lennon remarked that Help, along with Strawberry Fields Forever, was one of the most honest of his songs that he wrote during his days with the Beatles. Help, the movie, the album, and the single were all huge successes. The single went to number 1 in America for 3 weeks in the summer of 1965. Number 6, We Can Work It Out. We Can Work It Out is a testimony to the Beatles as collaborators. The song was written by Paul McCartney, once again reflecting the growth of the Beatles as songwriters. Paul explores the frustrations of relationships, trying to work out the differences. It has Paul's typical optimism. Paul believes that things can still be fixed. We can work it out. John adds the middle 8, which turns the song in an existential direction. Life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friends. And it is George who has the idea to put the middle 8 into 3/4 time, one of the most memorable and interesting parts of the song. The Beatles released We Can Work It Out along with Day Tripper as their first double A-side in December of 1965. This double A-side is one of the greatest singles of all time, both songs being of exceptional quality. The double A-side hit number 1 in the UK. In the US, both sides were top 5 hits again. Day Tripper made it to number 5, while We Can Work It Out spent 3 weeks at number 1. Number 6, Hello, Goodbye. 1967 was a very good year for the Beatles. They started the year with the amazing double A-side Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. Then they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that would become a game changer for the entire record industry. They wrote the anthem for the Summer of Love, All You Need Is Love, which they performed on live TV in front of a worldwide audience of 400 million people. And they closed out the year with a psychedelic TV movie, Magical Mystery Tour, and another number 1 hit single, Hello, Goodbye. Hello Goodbye is one Beatles single that is not universally praised. Some people think the song is inconsequential or not up to the quality of other Beatles singles. Personally, I disagree. But more importantly, the worldwide record-buying public really disagreed with that notion. Hello Goodbye's lyrics are, according to Paul McCartney, meant to reflect the duality of life. Everything has an opposite: yes, no, stop, go, high, low. Along with these lyrics is another super catchy McCartney melody and some great backing vocals by John and George. Also, this song features an amazing production by Sir George Martin. Hello Goodbye accomplished its mission. It became one of the Beatles' most successful singles. That's not my opinion, it's a fact. In the UK, it stayed at the top of the record retailer chart for an astounding 7 weeks. That's longer than any other Beatles single, other than From Me to You, which also had a 7-week run at number 1. In the US, it stayed at number 1 for 3 weeks, making it tied for 6th place in this list of the Beatles' biggest US hits. Number 5, Yesterday. The album Help showed a maturation in the songwriting efforts of both John Lennon and Paul McCartney. John with Help and Paul with Yesterday, another Beatles classic from the Help album. The music for Yesterday came to Paul in a dream. The words took a little longer. The title for the song came to McCartney when he was vacationing in Portugal in May of 1965. For the recording, Paul played acoustic guitar and sang the song. George Martin recorded a string quartet to add to the record. None of the other Beatles played on the song. Since the song had no other Beatles playing on the record, the group, including Paul, did not want Yesterday as a single in the UK. Capitol Records in America did not respect the Beatles' wishes and decided to release it as a single, the follow-up single to Help. Capitol released it as a single on September 13th, 1965, and it went to number 1, staying there for 4 weeks. Yesterday was released in almost every country and became a worldwide hit. In 1976, Yesterday was finally released as a single in the UK. 11 years after it was first written and recorded, it became a top 10 hit, 6 years after the Beatles had broken up. Number 3, Can't Buy Me Love. Can't Buy Me Love, a song written and sung by McCartney, became the Beatles' 6th single in the UK and was a follow-up to the massive hit I Want to Hold Your Hand. It was released at the very height of Beatlemania in March of 1964. There have been many pop music phenomenons in U.S. history, but no one has ever been as big as the Beatles were in America in 1964. They absolutely dominated the record chart and all of pop culture. Beatle memorabilia, Beatle pictures, and Beatle wigs were everywhere. Beatles were on the cover of almost every magazine. To give you an idea of how much the Beatles dominated the record charts in 1964, let me share with you just a few of the records the Beatles set on the Billboard Hot 100 charts. Number 1. For the first and only time in history, the Beatles had 3 consecutive number 1 singles. I Want to Hold Your Hand was replaced by She Loves You, which was replaced by Can't Buy Me Love. The Beatles had the number 1 single in the United States for 14 consecutive weeks. Number 2. When Can't Buy Me Love reached number 1 on April 4th, the Beatles held the entire top 5 on the Hot 100. Number 3. The next week, the Beatles had 14 different songs on the Hot 100 at the same time. Can't Buy Me Love was the first single released from the Beatles' first movie, A Hard Day's Night, and stayed at the top of the charts for 5 weeks. Number 3. Get Back. Get Back was to be an event that showed the Beatles getting back to their roots. It was going to show the Beatles recording live without a lot of studio effects in anticipation of the first live Beatles performance in 3 years. The Beatles had stopped touring in 1966 due to the limitations of sound technology during live performances, and so that they could devote more time to writing and recording in the studio. The first taste of this new Beatles event was an excellent rock and roll single, appropriately called Get Back. Get Back was written by Paul, and the Beatles worked together in the studio to flesh it out. The song's lyrics urge people to get back where they once belonged. And that's exactly what they did, showing that they continued to be the world's greatest rock and roll band. The Beatles got an assist from their good friend Billy Preston on keyboards. Billy Preston became the only musician in history to be credited alongside the Beatles on one of their singles. Get Back, backed with Don't Let Me Down, was released to the world on April 11th, 1969. It was the first Beatles single to debut at number 1 on the British singles chart, and the rest of the world would soon follow suit. Get Back became a worldwide number 1 in places such as Australia, Canada, and 12 other countries, including, of course, the United States, where it topped the charts for 5 consecutive weeks. Number 2, I Want to Hold Your Hand. In August of 1963, the Beatles released their biggest single to date in the UK, She Loves You. With its unforgettably catchy Yeah, Yeah, Yeah chorus, the single ruled the UK charts for an astonishing 6 weeks. Beatlemania swept through Great Britain. Everyone knew the Beatles, and it seemed like everyone loved the Beatles. At that point, I'm sure most people who followed pop music thought the Beatles could not get any bigger. They were wrong. They were really, really wrong. There was a lot of pressure on the Beatles for their next single to produce something as memorable and catchy as She Loves You. How could they possibly achieve that level of success again? But the incredible songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney came through in a huge way. Lennon and McCartney wrote a song that would literally change the world. A song called I Want to Hold Your Hand. Not only did I Want to Hold Your Hand replace She Loves You at the top of the charts in Britain, it also became their breakthrough single in the United States. Capitol Records released I Want to Hold Your Hand in the US on December 26, 1963, and by February, it had risen to number 1, where it stayed for 7 consecutive weeks. Beatlemania now spread throughout the entire United States and throughout the world. The Beatles were not merely the biggest pop music stars in the world, they were the biggest stars in the world, period, in any form of entertainment. Everyone in the world suddenly knew the names John, Paul, George, and Ringo. No last names needed. If there was any doubt about their astonishing popularity, they were completely erased on February 9th, when the Beatles performed I Want to Hold Your Hand and 3 other songs on The Ed Sullivan Show. That show was watched by more people in the United States than any other program in history up to that point. 73 million people, a record number, watched John, Paul, George, and Ringo. It was more than a TV show. It was a cultural milestone in the history of the 20th century. Number 1, Hey Jude. 4 years after Beatlemania, in 1968, the Beatles were still the undisputed kings of the rock and roll world. During those years, there were many great groups that challenged the Beatles, but no one could take the crown away from the 4 lads from Liverpool. Every Beatle album was an event. Every single from the group was a huge success. Still, there may have been some who thought that the Beatles' best days were behind them. It would be natural for people to think that the Beatles were due for a long, steady decline in terms of quality and popularity. Certainly, no one could maintain that level of both quality and success that the Beatles had achieved since 1963. Little did they know that some of their best songs and some of their greatest success was still to come. Hey Jude started out as Hey Jules. Paul McCartney wrote the song to comfort John's son, Julian, during the struggles of his parents' divorce. Paul encouraged Julian to take a sad song and make it better. That theme of optimism in the face of a tough situation struck a chord not just with Julian, but with the whole world. Hey Jude has become a universal anthem of hope in difficult times. The song starts out simply with Paul singing and playing the piano. The song continues to build until there's an entire orchestra playing and singing along with the Beatles. Hey Jude was a milestone in many ways, including its length. It clocks in at 7 minutes and 11 seconds. McCartney and George Martin were both concerned about the length, fearing that radio stations wouldn't play a single over 7 minutes. John Lennon was completely confident. He said, "They'll play it if it's us." And he was right. Hey Jude was universally loved and still is. During the turbulent times of 1968, it wasn't just the Beatles song everyone liked. It was the Beatles song everyone needed to hear. The themes of optimism and togetherness seemed to bring the entire world together. And when it came to that magnificent outro, the na-na-nas, let's just say that just as much now as back then, everyone loves to sing along with the Beatles. Hey Jude was released on August 26, 1968. It went to number 1 in the UK and everywhere else. In America, it became the Beatles' biggest U.S. hit, staying at number one for a record 9 consecutive weeks. Well, that's all I've got. What's your favorite Beatles song? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for joining me, and have a great day.